Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us in this cavernous room in Texture 103. My name is Mickey Huff. I'm professor of journalism here. I'm also the new distinguished director of the Park Center for Independent Media, part of the Park School, and also caucus with the journalism department here. I've only been here a couple of months. I was in California for 25 years teaching media literacy, history, social justice studies, and a number of other things. I also run the nonprofit Project Censored, Media Watchdog, and the work that I do there, along with president of the Media Freedom Foundation, overlaps rather extraordinarily with the mission of the Park Center for Independent Media that specifically looks at non-corporate structures of information dissemination. It looks at ethical public interest journalism more from a grassroots perspective, from the bottom up or from community reporting rather than top down, and also looks at other nonprofit models of journalism. So we're breathing more new life into the program. It was founded in 2008 by Jeff Cohen from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and Raza Rumi became the second director after 2018, and then I just came in here this summer. So it's a delight to be here with all of you at Ithaca College. And again, I appreciate people coming out, and some of you came out for the first event I did for Banned Books Week, and so I'm glad to see so many of you here today. We have a wonderful guest speaker with us today, Dr. Nolan Higdon. I'm going to introduce him properly in a moment, but before we do that, our topic today is Disinformation Nation, Critical Media Literacy for Election 2024. Hopefully we'll be giving you some things that you can take with you as sort of maybe toolkits, toolboxes, ideas to help navigate the often cacophonious sort of news media landscape we're going to talk about here. Again, the event here is brought to you by Park Center for Independent Media, co-sponsored by Project Censored, also the Department of Journalism. So special thanks to our chair, James Rada, and Associate Director of Park Center, Todd Shack, who's here with us. Also, want to give a special shout out to Project Look Sharp, one of our co-sponsors here. And I have to take a moment to congratulate our colleague, Cindy Scheib, who received the National Award for Service in Practice Advancing Media Literacy Education. So congratulations to Cindy, the amazing work you've done over the years and continue to do, winning a prestigious award from NAMLE, the National Association for Media Literacy. So not only is it wonderful to be talking about media literacy to all of you, it's fantastic to have fellow practitioners in the crowd with us, and also Kathy Michael from the library and others. So thank you so much for being here. Also, of course, special thanks to the Park School, our Dean, Amy Faulkner, and everyone in the Park School, particularly Brandy Howley, who was particularly helpful at helping me get things started here. Special thanks, of course, to Tara and Conference Event Services and Paul and AV Services, as well as the AV people that are here today, making all of this happen. So now that we've gotten through the many, many thank yous, I want to properly introduce our guest to you. Nolan Higdon is an author and lecturer at Merrill College and in the Education Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is a Project Censored National Judge and founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. Higdon's area of concentration include podcasting, digital culture, news media history, propaganda, and critical media literacy. You can see his work available at Substack at nolanhigdon.substack.com. He is the author of United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation and Post-Truth America, and What We Can Do About It, co-authored with yours truly, Guilty. Also, he is the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education, which is probably, it's one of the seminal works. It's basically one of the go-to works in critical media literacy education on news literacy. That'll obviously be coming up today. Dr. Higdon and I also co-authored a book, Let's Agree to Disagree, Critical Thinking Guide to Communication, Conflict Management, and Critical Media Literacy. Also, we were co-authors on The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. He's also most recently co-author with Allison Butler of Surveillance Education, Navigating the Conspicuous Absence of Privacy in Schools. And he is a regular source of expertise on media issues and current political events for CBS, NBC, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, among others. Dr. Nolan Higdon, welcome to Ithaca College.
Thank you.
So what we're going to do here for about maybe a half an hour or so is we're going to engage in conversation around today's topic, Disinformation Nation, Critical Media Literacy for Election 2024. Some of the things that we're going to talk about here are some tips for covering fake news. We're actually going to talk about sort of the genesis of this. It's not new. There's nothing new about what we call fake news, and Nolan's going to talk about that with us today. We're going to talk about ways to fight back against mis and disinformation, as well as malinformation and news abuse. We'll address some issues around constructive dialogue, how to talk with people across political divide. Here we are, a few weeks before another major presidential election. And at least according to the establishment narratives, we're a very divided nation. We have very hyper-partisan rhetoric in the country that's manifest in our corporate media outlets and by major candidates for the two major parties. So we're going to address some of that. We're also going to talk about how critical media literacy skills can help us deconstruct propaganda and also help us build bridges rather than walls, help us communicate with people with whom we have at least perceived differences. We may have real differences, but it's important to sort through some of the perceptions to realize maybe we aren't so divided as we're told we are. Maybe there are things we really share in common and values that are ways that we can understand each other enough to actually address the things that are happening. And again, media literacy is a great way to approach all of these kinds of challenges. I certainly know that the folks at Project Look Sharp would agree that there's not enough media literacy applied to everything. And so that's what we're going to be doing here today. And of course, we're going to be leaving time open, probably the last 20 minutes or so, because we want to hear from you all. And again, I'll do my best late great Phil Donahue impression running around the crowd with the microphone. There's a connection. Phil Donahue's connection to the Park Center for Independent Media is literally Jeff Cohen, who was the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting and Extra Magazine, the media watchdog, founded 10 years after Project Censored. So we're a little older than them. But Jeff was actually a senior producer for Phil Donahue when Donahue was on MSNBC on the run-up to the Second Iraq War in 2003. It was one of the highest rated television shows on MSNBC, and it was canceled because Phil Donahue was considered biased against the war. Never mind how all the rest of the outlets were for it. If Donahue wanted to have on somebody challenging the rhetoric coming out of the establishment, he had to have 2 or 3 pro-war candidates on to every one anti-war candidate, and that's what MSNBC called, quote, balanced coverage. But anyway, I'll be running around to hear from you because that's actually our favorite part of these events that we do is hearing from you all and hearing your comments, questions. We also love, as you know, one of the books we did is called Let's Agree to Disagree. We're no strangers to disagreement, and we know that there are a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives around the topics that we'll be covering today. And one of the things we like to do is we like to use points of disagreement as an invitation to, again, to build the bridges, not the walls. Figure out, well, where are you getting your information, and why do you have this different perspective? And then we can sort of share things. We can also talk about empathy. We can talk about critical listening, active listening, and so forth. But anyway, let's get things kicked off here. Dr. Nolan Higdon, let's get started and let's talk about one of the themes that you've addressed and we've addressed considerably in a lot of our work and writing is the concept of hyperpartisanship and sort of the how did we get here moments, right? How did we get to a place where we're divided? How do we get to a place then where there has been a moral panic around mis and disinformation? So I know we can start by defining some terms and talking a little bit about some history. Real quick, a nice quote maybe that will float over some of our conversation going back to 1710 when Jonathan Swift quipped that falsehoods fly and truth comes limping after. Well, that was a long time ago, but it seems quite true today, maybe even more so with our technology. So Nolan Higdon, let's get started and let's talk about some of these basic concepts about how we got here, hyperpartisanship, and some defining terms for fake news.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for showing up today. And I think a good place to start with that is to look at a few weeks after the events of January 6, 2021, there was a CBS poll that showed that Americans' #1 fear was other Americans. More than terrorism, more than climate change, it was other Americans. You can't really have democracy when you think the other side is not just someone you disagree with or someone you wish not to live under, but when you actually think they threaten your way of life. It becomes a much different way in which we frame our politics. There's certainly been politicians who have fed into this divisive rhetoric and are responsible for setting up the conditions of January 6th. But I like to go back even before that and argue that our media played a critical role in the divisiveness that we perceive today. You'll hear a lot of folks talk about the good old days of Walter Cronkite, and I'm not here to tell you about the good old days of Cronkite. There were certainly problems in the news media back then. The CIA working with journalists through Operation Mockingbird is one example. But more importantly, what I want to bring up about Cronkite is a different type of news. Cronkite would try and get the largest audience possible. One commentator said that under Cronkite, you wanted to get the racist uncle and the teenager in like the Che Guevara shirt to watch the show at the same time together. That was basically true for how news media did things until the cable news revolution fractured audiences, and Fox figured out that one of the ways in which you could keep an audience and make money is if you targeted one demographic and you maximize your wealth from it. And Fox chose older, white, wealthy conservatives as their demographic. MSNBC would later get on board to go for suburbanite liberals, and CNN, depends on what week it is, they're trying to figure out their identity 34 years in. So that really divided the audience. And the ways in which they kept audiences were they used a basically pro wrestling approach to programming, which is we cheer the good guy, the Republican in the case of Fox, and you boo the character of the bad guy, which would be the Democrats on Fox, and the reverse on MSNBC. And you do that for 20 or 30 years, people start to get comfortable in confirming their bias, and they start to think they know everything about the quote unquote other side, even though it's a character. And you transition from trying to understand or see the humanity on the other side to hating them. But the story's not over there, because of course we know the internet came next. And a lot of these legacy news outlets, they basically went the same way of cable news. So Washington Post, New York Times, they started going to subscriber-based models. And the last thing you want to do is irritate your subscribers, so you feed them stuff that they believe. And I want to, point out, this isn't speculation. We know this from like the Fox News text, right? The Dominion lawsuit. Fox News personalities are openly saying, we know this election was not stolen. We know that the claims that it was stolen are bullshit, but our audience wants to believe it's stolen. So we need to keep giving them content that says it's stolen. That's how we make our money. Social media is an important part of this game as well. The whole way they make money is by keeping people on their screen, keep giving more and more data. You keep people on their screen by confirming their bias and playing to hate and fear, especially about the other side. So our media plays a critical role in shaping our worldview. A lot of us operate in bubbles where our bias is confirmed and we're pushed or nudged to hate the other side. And fake news is really great at that. Fake news, the best fake news, has elements of hate and fear. It gets people to react emotionally before they're able to critically think their way through it. And in a political environment, when there's an election going on, that's a really powerful tool. If you can get people outraged about, Haitian immigrants eating pets, for example, you can get people in a huff about it. You can get attention drawn to it. It's a simple story, and it distracts from other stories. Or Mickey's question started. I don't know if this is where you were going, but that explains the feeling of division. But I also want to argue to all of you two things. One is the political parties that run the establishment are mostly not divided. If you look at their rhetoric, it's highly divisive. But go look at actual policies. Even someone like Trump with very divisive rhetoric, a lot of the stuff he was able to accomplish was basically your standard boilerplate Republican policies, like tax cuts, or even the border wall. That was an idea from 2006. That was not a Trump original, like many other things. Trump stole that. So it distracts from those sort of establishment agreements, and I think it makes the public feel like we're more divided than we are. When if you actually look at things like access to abortion or some gun control, overwhelming majorities of the American public agree. But our media gets a lot of money from dividing us on those issues. And so you have to kind of recognize the divisive nature of a lot of our rhetoric and political discourse, but in reality, there's a lot more overlap and agreements than we sometimes give the nation credit for.
So in terms of the how we got here part, you've written about a gradual sort of capture, if you will, or a sort of corporate capture of institutions like the political realm, dark money, like education and media, right? Where they seem to operate less and less in the public interest over the last half of the 20th century. And we've actually identified several of these. We looked at the hyper-partisan media. We've looked at sort of a collapse in education, a lack of critical thinking, certainly a lack of media literacy education in K-12, which has actually contributed to a lot of these issues. So thinking of that on the background, Lao Tzu, if you're not careful, you'll end up where you're heading. right? We've been heading into this kind of abyss for quite some time. But a lot of this came to a head after the 2016 election, and that's when the phrase fake news was birthed into the culture, right? And I'm sorry we're here using the term, and Nolan has a book with that title, and I know people are just tired of hearing fake news because it's still used, it's still weaponized, right? We still hear people using it in the political spectrum, accusing things they don't like or disagree with as fake news. But there's a real challenge here, and if we define it and we look at what fake news is as propaganda, there's nothing new about it. The weaponization of it, however, after 2016 was really interesting. And so it also gave rise to us as a culture talking a little bit more openly about misinformation and disinformation. And then, of course, there's something that came along that's called malinformation. None of these things are new either, right? These are not new concepts. But the fact that they've all kind of exploded across society through our media as things that we need to be concerned about, it's really important to have education. It's really important to have accurate definitions of what these terms are and how they're applied. So, Nolan, can you talk to us a little bit about some differences between disinformation and malinformation? And then we want to talk about that, the sort of moral panic around it. The establishment, the government, our major news media outlets, social media outlets, educators, there was sort of a rallying cry of like, what are we going to do about fake news, right? We've got to do something about it. And so we want to get into that part of the conversation too. But Nolan, walk us through some of these definitions and some of the things that you addressed in your book, Anatomy of Fake News.
Yeah, it's where Mickey started out there. I think is perfect. The dominant ethos in this country since the 1970s has been that we need to rearrange everything for the purpose of the market. That includes education, that includes the press, even our democracy. We need to be market focused. If you've worked in education, you've heard this before again and again. But the problem is, and this is, I think, a central part of what we're talking about here today, is the market really doesn't value a lot of democratic processes or structures. A free press that informs a critical thinking public to be active in their democracy and hold the powerful accountable, that's not really profitable for a lot of people and companies. But a nation that will buy a sweatshirt or buy something online as an act of participating in democracy, that's something that is profitable. So the market has really limited a lot of what we do in terms of education, the press, two critical pillars of our democracy. And we'll get to this later on in the talk, but that includes media literacy. We're going to have to talk about two forms of media literacy today, which is the corporate media literacy, the sort of techno-utopian, get the tools in their hands, all about access, let's get them hooked on them approach. So those who want to teach students how to ask critical questions about the media they use and how they interact with it. And there's a lot of very wealthy corporations who are trying to go for the first and trying to kill those of us in the latter. But the fake news, I actually don't apologize for using it. I've been very frustrated with journalists over the last 8 years who have shied away from the term. I know they had it shouted at them and they were vilified for being so-called fake news, but I argue that's more of a time to stand up against Trump's weaponization of the term. Fake news does have a meaning. It's any false or misleading content that's presented as legitimate journalism. I don't need Trump to redefine that for me, and I don't need to accept Trump's definition, nor do I think those in the journalistic class should either. So I don't apologize for using it whatsoever. As a term, though, it's an umbrella term. It does include a lot of the things you mentioned, such as propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, and so-called malinformation. Yeah, for disinformation and misinformation, people usually point to the issue of intent. So disinformation is content that's created with the intent to deceive, or misinformation, maybe accidentally distributed. So to give you a misinformation example, like on 9/11, there were some reporters who claimed they heard reports of Muslims dancing in the streets. They reported on the fact they have heard these reports. Those reports turned out to be false, but that put the fake news story out into the media ecosystem that people now claim Muslims celebrated on 9/11 by dancing in the streets. Or this one that's been lost to history, but if you guys remember after Sandy Hook, they found another person in camouflage with a gun outside of the school, and that reported there were 2 shooters that day. Turned out that person had nothing to do with the shooting, but that story has always been out there that was proof of a government orchestrated conspiracy or whatever. So those are examples of misinformation where reporters did report on things they were hearing or seeing. They put them out there, and they later on turned out to be false. Malinformation, I've had some problem with this. I think it's it opens up an era of subjectivity that I think is dangerous to how we use it. But essentially malinformation is when you introduce true or verifiable evidence, but it lacks the context for accurate understanding of it. The reason why I think that's a little subjective is because who's to say what is the right context for that information? And I've seen this already weaponized in the last election cycle. If there's true video, for example, and people are interpreting it in ways that news media don't like, the news media refer to it as malinformation. Like, well, if you had more context, you would interpret it differently. Like, well, who's to say their interpretation is any better than yours? And so I think that gets back to how some of these terms have been weaponized to try and silence people. And one of the things I want to articulate to you all today and advocate for is there's a lot of solutions out there to deal with the fake news problem. And Mickey mentioned how it's not a new problem. I like to point back to books like Sapiens and by Harari and others. But I think pointed out that the whole human experience is based on gossip culture. We're communicative beings, so we depend on interacting with each other. One of the coolest things about being human is we can create and imagine. This is how we tell stories and find connection. But that also means we can create and legitimize total BS. So what I'm telling you is it's a part of the human experience. We're always going to deal with false information. Any of these strategies that try and eradicate false information, I know immediately are setting us up for failure. There are other solutions like censorship or lists of trustworthy news sites. I don't like those things either. I really do believe in the radical idea of democracy. I do believe that it should be of, by, and for the people, and that none of us need any outside actor to tell us what's true or false. I believe we have the ability to do it ourselves. Education plays a critical role in giving people the skills and how to determine the veracity of information so they know how to think, not what to think when they go through it. And so that's what I advocate for here in dealing with these. Terms are important to understand, but I'm more interested in giving people the skills to determine the veracity of information for themselves.
So given the moral panic that sort of was around the problems of fake news, malinformation, there were congressional hearings, social media executives were hauled before Congress, right? And they were finger wagged, like, what are you folks doing? And again, the social media folks like to say, hey, we're not journalists. We just provide the playground that people are in. It's not our fault these things happen. And then, of course, they'll also haul big CEOs from media corporations to Congress, and they'll say, hey, it's not all our problem that the American people want to hear dumb things, and we're just kind of feeding them some of the junk food news that they already want. It's not our fault, right? So apparently no one's at fault, but everyone's at fault, right? So there then was this quest for solutions, right? So even though we didn't exactly have a handle on all the definitions and the chaos of the weaponization of terminology, and certainly the ideological weaponization of it, we started to see more and more solutions, right? People saying, well, here's how we fix it. And then we saw the cottage industry of fact checking, right? Like fact checking used to be something that was done in the newsroom. I don't know, like, is that like not done anymore in the newsroom? Are there no ombuds people remaining? Are editors not somehow on the hook for this? Again, it's almost as if that whole world, that whole Society of Professional Journalists code of ethics driven part of the news industry somehow just evaporated. And somehow we needed new ways to check out what was happening. So we had fact checkers. So we had fact checking and fact checking institutions. Some of them were connected to journalistic outlets and universities. Some of them were private for-profit corporations, Snopes. And of course, many of them had various conflicts of interest. That raises another question: who checks the checkers, right? We saw big tech come up with some ideas that they thought were wonderful. So you've got Google and a bunch of people from the national security complex creating something called NewsGuard that they're going to embed in your browser. And no thinking is required from you, dear citizen. Just let the green, yellow, and red shield tell you which sources are good and which sources are bad, according to the people behind NewsGuard, who are from the national security state and the big tech sector, who might also have other interests, right? So we had this whole parade of solutions and products come out that were allegedly easy and they wouldn't hurt you and you wouldn't have to do much other than click a button and trust someone you never met, right? But again, critical media literacy scholars took a look at that and said, that's interesting. That's potentially useful for people. But it is also potentially misleading or abusive or biased or can be used to reinforce certain types of propaganda. That's not to say that they don't have any good purpose, but it's to say that there were other uses and effects that sometimes have been overlooked. So Nolan Higdon, in your work and research, you've looked at some of these solutions, right? And you've also, one of the solutions, of course, was censorship, censoring ideas. By labeling it fake news or labeling it false content, that suggests, well, it should be censored. It should be suppressed. But we do need to go back, and this is where you're going to chime in here. We need to go back to see who's claiming that something is false, who's claiming which narratives are groundless. And that's something that we need to be very careful about, and that's a very slippery slope when we embrace some of the techno-determinist stuff and we sort of embrace unquestioningly these solutions that have all been trotted out. And in fact, we even published like 5 years ago now, we published a piece in Censored 2020 about how this entire fear of fake news was actually a Trojan horse used by corporate media outlets to silence independent alternative voices in media by just simply dismissing them as fake news because they were talking about narratives and perspectives that were not widely covered in the establishment press. So what we end up having is maybe a seemingly well-intentioned effort to police information into democracy. Hey, by the way, there's nothing new about this, right? Walter Lippmann, John Dewey, 100 years ago. But here we are still grappling with it with different technologies. So Nolan Higdon, in your work, can you talk about some of your findings and things that you've talked about, including what we've called censorship by proxy? So it's not the prior restraint government coming in technically to censor, even though we know there's examples of them doing that. It was sort of left up for the marketplace and big tech companies and so forth to curate information. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, when these, for folks who aren't clear, moral panics are basically when you take a perceived or real incident and you sensationalize, you make it more hyperbolic, you claim it's everywhere and ubiquitous, and that it's responsible for so many of the problems in society. You can think of things like the satanic panic, if you're old enough to remember that, or the crack babies that didn't exist in the 80s, for example. So fake news was the same thing coming out of 2016. Fake news was all of a sudden responsible for everything. Electoral outcomes, ignorance, hate, violence. Fake news was behind it all. And at some level, that's true. Fake news obviously has some influence. But a lot of the research was pretty shoddy on what effects it was having on people. And I just give you an example. I'm going to assume everybody in this room is an anti-racist. If I handed you a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf, I don't think you'd immediately turn into a white supremacist just because you saw it. You're a thinker. You're able to decide for yourself. You're able to reject information. So just the fact you have access to so-called fake news doesn't mean they're going to internalize it or legitimize it. And I think that's a big mistake of a lot of the moral panic. So we assume because it's out there, everybody must be believing it or being deceived by it. To your point, yeah, there's a whole disinformation expert market that was created out of this. Is only capitalism can do. It can create the profit motive to create the problem and the profit motive for the supposed solution. And so that was a lot of this talk. The press saw an opportunity, as Mickey talked about, to reassert themselves as protecting truth. Remember, Washington Post launched "Democracy Dies in the Dark," and CNN had the commercial with the apple and the banana. I forget which one it was, but I think if it's an apple, say it's an apple, even if it looks like a banana. Which begged the question, right? Like, what were you doing the last 30 years? Why did it take Donald Trump getting elected before you decided to hold the powerful accountable? So I always thought that was a horrible admission that they were advertising themselves. But this moral panic did put pressure on the political class to take action, and they decided that the solution was to put pressure on social media companies in particular. And as Mickey pointed out, this is what leads to censorship by proxy. And so hopefully everyone in here knows we have in the First Amendment that we have the right to speech, we have the right to publish what we want in this country. But that protects us from government intervening into those. So if government convinces or pressures a private industry to do it on their behalf, according to the Supreme Court, that does not break your First Amendment right. And these companies, so the internet, GPS, touchscreen, all those innovations came from the military-industrial complex. These came out of a private or government money and public schooling did this research. And we allowed those things to be commercialized. And now these companies, they have very low regulation. They pay very low taxes. They basically are shielded from any liability for a lot of things in their platform. So when government comes to them and says, hey, we really want Alex Jones off your platform, the government's not saying we're going to start taxing you or we're going to start regulating you or we're going to take away those lucrative government contracts we give for like Amazon and Google to house your data. But the implication is there. If you don't remove the content we want, we could easily do that. And some folks like AOC have been much more vocal about saying that publicly. So there's a conflict of interest there. And the companies consistently work on behalf of who's in power. And I know the Republicans like to complain that it's a left bias against right. But go back and look at it. It's whoever's in office. When Donald Trump was in office, Mark Zuckerberg did all he could to cozy up to Donald Trump. They held a ton of meetings, even as late as 2019. As soon as Biden got elected, flip the scripts. They were willing to take Trump off the platform. They're working with the Biden administration to get rid of content. And if Trump wins here in 2024, I bet you'll see the exact same reversal. But the for-profit motive is the one that drives these companies. But besides all that, the regulating of content creates serious problems. You allow government actors to dictate what content is on the platform when they can pressure social media. This is why TikTok got banned in this country. TikTok would not play a game with the US government. They were giving too much counter information as the government saw it on, it's malinformation, on Gaza, on TikTok. And so Senator Mitt Romney admitted that that's why they banned TikTok. It was giving an alternative narrative on Gaza, where the US companies will play ball. Anything you could say bad about TikTok, about the negative mental health effects or physical effects or data collection, surveillance, privacy, you can say about any platform. But they chose TikTok because it wouldn't play ball on Gaza. And then secondly, the moderation of content. What I don't like about it is it breaks it down to an individual problem. Fake news on social media is not due to Alex Jones. It's not due to Donald Trump. It's not due to any of you. They've designed the platforms in a way that puts false content over truth. There's been up-teen studies on this. False information spreads further and faster and reaches more people on social media platforms than truth does. And so they're the ones who probably need to be censored or moderated, if anybody. It's not the users themselves that are responsible in a lot of these cases. And they've abused this power, as Mickey pointed out. If you work in independent media in 2017, 2018, you'll know what I mean by the adpocalypse, which is when these companies change their algorithms to demonetize independent press outlets. And it was a huge destruction. But again, it got rid of a lot of the counter narratives that threaten the establishment. So they got a thumbs up from those folks. And then also I want to point out, I know this shouldn't have to be said, but I'm going to say it anyways. They don't possess any powers you do not possess. And they consistently decide to censor content that they claim is false, that they later on admit is true. The Hunter Biden laptop story is one that got a lot of press that I think is critically important. Go back and look at the press reports. The press said this has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. And then 2 years later, Washington Post, New York Times wrote corrections and said, no, actually it was Hunter Biden's laptop. That press reporting wasn't true. But they had censored it during the election season, they being the social media companies, and Twitter even censored it in DMs, which they usually only do for things like child pornography. You could even share the article in direct messaging during that election. They also said that there was no debate on the origin of COVID, so we're going to get rid of anything that talks about lab leak, only to turn around a year and a half later to say, well, there are some people in the CDC, there are some people in the FBI, there are some people in the Atomic Energy Commission. Okay, I guess we can allow it back on the platform. It's like, thank you, tech lords. I'm glad we're allowed to discuss this again. So these are the problems with censorship. It doesn't matter what the issue is, what candidate you like, you're really undermining democracy by normalizing this behavior. And I have to blame the public in one respect, though. I think we've become too cultured and used to being able to block and get rid of things we don't like. We purposely block ourselves from other ideas, which may be convenient in some cases, but it makes us blocked from the democratic process. We do not get to engage with other ideas. We don't get to listen. We don't get to learn. We don't get to be heard as a result of that. So as a user, also, I think we should refrain from normalizing this blocking of people and information in our way.
So what we wanted to do is we wanted to talk about, even though there are many things happening, we mentioned about fact checking and so forth as a way of addressing fake news. We've long advocated that the real antidote for sorting out this kind of information is media literacy education. Is if you teach people from the time that they're young how to interact with media, how to even be the media, right? Then you're dealing with a different set of people coming in from another generation, that they're not just hit with this all at once later. You know, I mean, as somebody that's been a history professor for 25 years, in California before coming here, I would always get the same thing, and Nolan the same thing as well, is that you'd have people coming into class and you talking about things and they'd be like, I never heard of that, or that can't be true, or this wasn't on the test. You all are familiar with this, right? Yeah, well, the same thing is true when you take a look at media literacy or illiteracy, or civic literacy or illiteracy. It's the real challenge is that we haven't always done a great job of teaching people at an appropriate age, and again, content appropriate for age as well. But we haven't really infused it. And what we've been long saying for years now is that we need critical media literacy education coming from the bottom up and from the lower grades to the higher, such that when people get through secondary education, they already know all of these things, right? They're almost like mini experts in media literacy in a lot of ways, which is essential to existing in our society, right? As the FCC chairperson Nick Johnson once said about, the importance of independent media and the importance of media reform and the importance of the free press, I think applies to media literacy. Regardless of whatever your primary area of interest is, if your second isn't supporting these endeavors, you're likely to end up in a very confused and, well, maybe misinformed or underinformed society. You're likely to gain very little ground in your primary areas of interest if people don't have these skills. So Nolan, talk to us a little bit about some of the antidotes to this critical media literacy education. What are some of the solutions? I think we have this maybe working now that we can keep clicking through it. So tell us a little bit about this, and then we want to hear from our audience.
Yeah, and I'm putting this up here because in a minute I'm going to show a slide that has way too many words. But it's a summation of that brief resource guide, the fake news and the election, and you can get it at projectcensor.org or register for my Substack. And for folks who don't know what a Substack is, when I publish something, it sends it directly to your email. I don't charge any money. I'm not a good capitalist. So you get it for free. I try to send something out like once every 2 weeks or so. If folks want to look at that rather than the overly worded slide I'm about to show you. I won't go through all these, but just some tips I have for folks, especially in an election year, is resist the pressure. So much of our culture today tries to get you to move really fast without thinking, but slow down, spend more time with less content. You can't know everything and be outraged about everything all at once. There are limits to being a human. We can't be in fight or flight 24/7. So really try to prioritize those things you care about, and closely related, social media is a lot of things, but I don't really consider it social. So if you really do care about a particular issue, I would argue social media platforms are designed in a way to make that topic trivial and get people to not think about it. So if it's a topic you care about, I probably wouldn't bring it into the social media space. If you care about it, that's not a good space to negotiate that topic. We spend a lot of time talking about others, but I want to encourage folks to spend more time thinking about themselves. Fake news is really good at confirming existing biases. So when you find content you think owns the other side and proves you right, that's definitely a sign to slow down. I would extra check that stuff because that's usually some of the best manipulators. One of my biggest frustrations is polling. Scrutinize the polls, try to understand the polls. At best, a great poll captures a moment in time. So poll from a month ago really matter very little today. Also, there's a thing called the margin of error. So when these polls are like 1 point different, and the media is like, oh, look, Trump pulled ahead. But it's a margin of error of 5. He could be ahead by 6, he could be down by 4. It's irrelevant. So the polls, try not to take them too seriously. They're a helpful piece of information, but I wouldn't be overly wary of them. Be wary of selected edits. Anytime you see quick cuts in the middle of a video or where a video starts or ends, that's usually a bad sign. MSNBC just got popped for cutting a Joe Rogan video to show him endorsing Harris. He complained and they sent out a correction, but it was a pretty convincing video. So watch out for that selective editing. Take your time. Also, language is very important, and think about how we describe ourselves. A lot of our market function describe us as consumers. When it comes to news media, I would argue don't be a consumer, be a user, or be a citizen. Citizens use news media, to get better understanding of their world, to determine how or if they're going to participate, if they're going to vote, if they're going to protest. Be a media citizen, not a mindless media consumer. I think that's a helpful way to think about yourself. It's election time, so everybody has a great origin story about how they've always been altruistic since the moment of birth, and they've had the greatest struggle in the world, and somehow they've overcome it to be great, a symbol of family. Interrogate those stories. A lot of the stories that Harris camp puts out about her or Trump puts out about himself are just wildly off from the facts. So try to get to know these folks a little better on a personal level. Be very cognizant of the alarm bells of race and race reductionism in the United States as well. Racism is baked into the American cake, literally baked into the US Constitution. It's a huge part of who we are as a culture. And racism plays very well, especially in freaking out white audiences. This goes back to the days of Willie Horton ads and things like that. So when there's any mention of race or description of race, your ears should perk up to that, to think about not only why they're saying that, but who might this harm as well. On the flip side, sometimes there's race reductionism as well. We choose to only look at race when there are other critical, important issues that we're distracting from as well. So always be very cognizant of that. Don't trust the headlines. One of my big frustrations when I publish work, except the project center, they always change the headlines, and oftentimes the headlines don't match what I just wrote. So don't trust the headlines, especially in the clickbait era. They're really good at saying things, making you think you read something you didn't. So if you don't want to be a part of the fake news problem, don't read the headline and share. Investigate the article or content. If you know about influencers, most of what you see on the media or on social media is false. It's paid for by somebody else. The Harris team has put a ton of money behind influencers. I would assume Trump has, but I haven't seen any reporting on it. But Harris has put a ton of money. There's a lot of influencers out there who are acting like average people making content, but they're really a paid part of campaigns. We live in the age of AI and deepfakes. Seeing is believing is over. Just because you saw something doesn't mean it's true. I like to tell folks, I watched a whole documentary that 30 for 30 made with Al Davis, the ex-owner of the Raiders, who's now passed away, talking, and a former commissioner of the NFL also talking. Both of them are dead, but they generated AI images. And I watched it for 2 hours and forgot that I was listening to dead people. This stuff is very convincing. So just because you see it doesn't mean necessarily believe it. Verify it's journalism, as we've talked about a lot. I don't think it's a shock to this crowd. There are codes of ethics. There are journalistic handbooks. If an outlet's not following it, it's something else than journalism. So don't lean on it as news and information. Identify conflicts of interest, not only in who owns the media outlet. So General Electric owned NBC while advocating for war. General Electric's also in the defense industry. That's a conflict of interest, right? There's a reasonable conclusion is that GE is only supporting war so they can make profits. Ditto with the journalists themselves. Look at the code of ethics of the person writing the article. Journalists also have codes of ethics. For example, usually most codes of ethics say you shouldn't cover a family member. But CNN allowed Chris Cuomo to do just that. And he used that power to conceal the fact his brother was being accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault and shielding old folks' homes from some of the crimes they may have committed against older folks during COVID. So watch out for those conflicts of interest. And then I talked about representation. Oh yeah, and then make sure you understand the content. Fake news is really good at making leaps in logic where we think we had evidence for something that we didn't. So if you have a moment where you think something doesn't make sense, play into that, hold on to that. If it doesn't make sense, it's not you not understanding, it's probably the content itself is made to deceive. So those are some of the tips I have. I know that's a lengthy list, but that's why I give you that Substack link. It has more explanations and election-focused examples in there as well.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to contact me, I'm happy to share that, share the PowerPoint, or share other resources and articles that were referenced here. We want to wrap things up and hear from you all in the time we have left, but I wanted to end just very quickly on one of the things that we were going to get to. It was involves listening, because here we are, it's in election season. There's a lot of talking, a lot of messaging going on, right? But are we really hearing what people are saying, right? We filter, everybody has their own filters, right? And we hear things and we may jump to conclusions, we may have assumptions. But one of the things I just wanted to remind folks in terms of critical listening is that we need to really be sure that we hear a message that is coming at us and decipher the meaning of it and recall what we're hearing or seeing and think critically about it. Be deliberate about the fact that we're thinking about it, right? I mean, taking a minute, the slowing down, the stopping, the wait a minute. And then look to provide feedback, right? And then try to engage in dialogue. The late philosopher Daniel Dennett actually had 4 points that we quoted in one of our books that I think is pretty important, but not always easy to do, especially when you're talking with people where you have pretty vivid disagreements. And these include attempting to re-express another person's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that they may respond by saying, "Thanks, I wish I thought of putting it that way." Right? Show them that you're listening. Like, did I get that right? The other is list points of agreement, especially if they're not matters of general or widespread agreement. Find the bridge before you build the wall. Is there one? Maybe there won't be, but there certainly won't one just presenting itself if you're not looking for it, right? Mention anything you might have learned from this other person or this other party, right? Just anything at all. I mean, let's not be sarcastic and say, "Oh, I learned how wrong you are," right? But where is there any point that you can see that? And only then should you have words of rebuttal and critique, right? Critical listening and empathetic listening is really about processing things. It's not just about waiting for your turn to talk again. So anyway, we hope that you found some of these things useful. And speaking of your turn to talk again, it's your turn to talk. And so in the time we have left, feel free to ask any questions, or if you have any comments you want to deliver or anything you'd like to share with us or our speaker, Dr. Nolan Higdon, now's a great time to do it. Anybody want to jump on and have a thing to say? Anybody? Yeah, here you go.
Thanks so much, you guys. That was great. So Chris Berry, Project Look Sharp, Ari and Cindy and others. I'm interested in metacognition. We tend to focus in K-12 education a whole lot on what information we can fill kids up with, what particular skills, tools we can give them in a short period of time for them to kind of repeat that back for exit of the classroom, et cetera. But I think this work also requires habits, things that have to be repeated over time, et cetera. And I'm seeing the building of that in K-12 education around some of the good information that students have in some of the specific skills. But the place that I'm most interested in, because I think it's missing, is getting students, teaching students from pre-K on up to be self-reflective about their own thinking and how their own interpretations of mediated messages, from books to posters on the wall to social media, et cetera, is filtered through their own lenses. Because I think as the technology improves, having the next specific tool to identify the fakeness or the truth will be important, but it's not going to work if we can't also teach our kids how to not only pause to think about the sourcing and the accuracy, but to also think about their own interpretations and the impact that that has on their critical thinking about everything they're seeing and hearing.
Right, I think it's a great point, and it makes me think of two things. One I mentioned about, I think we blew it on the internet. When the internet came out, I think we let the techno-utopians dominate the conversation, and you were looked as like old and out of touch for raising questions about the way they were integrated into the culture. Like, I always use the example, if you and I were at dinner right now, and I pulled out a book and started reading it, you would think I was rude and probably stand up and walk away. But if I pull out my phone and check email, it's like, yeah, that's fine. We've normalized, I think, the integration of these tools in problematic ways. And I think we need to be proactive in the age of AI, to your point about where things are coming down the pipe, thinking about how do we want to behave culturally with these? Where is appropriate and inappropriate to build those habits of metacognition? I do think one of the things we're up against in the United States, though, is our decentralized schooling system, which is both a blessing and a curse. which is there are great folks who decades before me have been working in the media literacy space who did everything they could to try and get this in from, preschool all the way up through university system. But it's really difficult to do if you don't have money, because you have to go to every school board, you have to change all that you have to, well, not all of it, but some of it, and you have to train the teachers. You need professional development, which costs money and costs time. And we don't have an education czar who can wave a wand and get it into school. So I think what you're talking about is correct. But to give some perspective on the battle, I think we're still just at a point where we're convincing people that we need to study film in schools like more seriously. We need to study podcasts and now AI. There's a lot of resistance to it. So even getting it in the classroom before we talk about the cultural practices of metacognition, I don't think we're there yet. But that list of organizations I had up here, they're doing a lot of that work in the nonprofit space, because that's the best we have in the United States right now. But I completely agree with you. The metacognition is the higher level, and at my institution, that's one of our focus, is how I was able to get the classes by having a metacognition focused course. Totally agree. Thank you.
So obviously with the whole metacognition thing, one of the huge things of it is like, you can't confirm if you're right for thinking about thinking and things like that. Can you speak about some environments where you feel people are really able to share their points of metacognition and like grow with others, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at thinking of some of the examples where you can't have that space. Yeah, I mean, the classroom ideally should be that space. That should be what we should be doing as educators. We should be giving a space. I think your comment spoke to that as well, about sharing how you interact with media and information as a student. So I think that's one of the best places that we have. We were supposed to also have a news media that did that. That's the idea of news media, right? The marketplace of ideas. As I mentioned, that's sort of gone by the wayside in a lot of ways. I think schools are one of the last places, but I would be remiss if I didn't say they are under a lot of threats. One of them is just the surveillance of schools. If anything says smart on it, that means it's surveilling you. And once students and faculty become aware of that, they start to attenuate what they're saying and thinking to a larger audience. Like, maybe you would share this if it was totally private because you're okay to be wrong, right, in a school environment. Maybe you don't want the whole world to know you're wrong about this one thing in 2024. And so back, anybody who's an educator, you can't do that in education. Students have to take risks. Students have to make mistakes. Ditto with faculty. That's why we have academic freedom. They need to do their interpretations and think out loud through them. But we're increasingly losing that space. I also do think a lot of the application process for hiring faculty has had requirements often claim to promote diversity, but I think are looking for homogeneity of thought. So the diversity that we do see in terms of gender, sexuality, race, class, age, they can do a good job of that. But the ideology isn't really that diverse, so the students lose out. They don't get a lot of faculty across the ideological spectrum who they can debate with and learn from. So those are some of the threats we have, but I still think, despite those threats, that education is some of the best spaces where we can have those discourses. And then I do want to throw a resource. I'm not an area of expertise here, but I think it's something worth bringing up, is the Critical Media Project at USC has a bunch of free resources, and they actually got started to answer your question. They wanted to have people talk about media, particularly parents, and now it's kind of morphed into communities. But they have resources and perspective on how you can start the exact spaces you're talking about. So here's some resources and perspectives and videos we can bring in to start a conversation about X, Y, or Z. So that might be somewhere to look that'll better answer that question as well.
I just put the Critical Media Project site, Allison Trope. This is a really fantastic site and really, really useful resource around this. And also Jeff Shares at UCLA.
Education 166.
Education 166.
Library Guide. The Education 166 Library Guide at UCLA has resources for everything media literacy related. Jeff put together quite a library guide there. We have other questions? Sorry.
Oh, there it is. I missed it.
Mickey?
Yes.
Put in that mic.
Yeah. Kathy.
It's Kathy.
Go ahead. Yeah, Kathy, go ahead.
Microphone, I pretty loud. It's not really, I guess it's, one thing I've been thinking about, maybe from my namely workshops I've attended, is the critical media is actually being able to evaluate using mentals, but there's also the socio-emotional part of it too. So I'm kind of interested in, there was one program where people were training other students how to have ethics and treat each other and stand up for one another. So how much, being on social media, the coarseness and people just automatically bashing one another if they're real people and not bots and that kind of thing, how much does that play into this process?
I think it's huge. It's one of the major concerns about having that lack of face-to-face connection, or even like real-time synchronous communication, whether it has nonverbal cues or not. We lose a lot. We see the keyboard courage and screen bravery, where people will talk to people in a way they would never say things to their face. So I've seen a lot of the work promoting like netiquette, which I think has been helpful in some regards. But we also have to be frank here, and I don't want to play too much of an age card here, because this is a problem for people of all ages, just like fake news is a problem for people of all ages. But we do have younger people, and I'm talking grade school, maybe middle school, who are getting access to these tools who I don't think have an awareness of what the possible damage can be. And they're not necessarily bad people at that young of an age. They're engaging in forms of bullying that were they didn't exist when I was a kid. Bullying existed certainly, and it was bad then and it's bad now, but there's a whole other level of bullying now that these tools allow. And then I know your question seemingly in relation to social media, but I'm even looking worse down the line with what's possible with AI now. Just imagine if you can make a video of another kid in the class doing anything that you can imagine, or their voice out of context saying things they didn't say. And that bullying now follows. You can send those videos and messages to them at home. They can watch in real time as people are mocking them 24/7. So I think there's serious concerns. And this gets back to, I think, part of the cultural response I had to metacognition question. We need to spend time talking about ethics and damage to students. I just think it's an ignorance. They don't understand what's being done here in mental health. So I think there's a great opportunity for that type of work. She's a little bit of a controversial figure, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of her, but she's done really great work in this space. Dana Boyd, I think, has done some good stuff, jumping ahead of other folks on the concerns of bullying in the digital era. And Dana and Boyd are both lowercase. Brandon.
Thanks so much, everybody. We're actually past the time for the event, and I don't want to keep people any longer. But last but surely not least, here is the Project Look Sharp website for Ithaca College. So if you aren't familiar with it, you should be. And we have, again, these lists of sites and things to share. We just shared Jeff Share's site from UCLA. Here's projectlooksharp.org. We also shared the Critical Media Project. Nolan's guide for detecting fake news election 2024 is available at the Project Censored website. And we have something called In the Classroom. And if you go down and look, you can see a lot of the different teaching guides and the resource guides that we have. These are all free, by the way. So we encourage people to try to use them, share them. And we also like to hear feedback, right? So these are live documents in a lot of ways. We get feedback from students and educators, and we go back and add things, or we change things, or if somebody points out something that maybe we didn't get right, we admit that and we want to go and make it better, right? So think of at least as far as the Project Censored stuff goes and the kind of work that Nolan does, that we do together, it's sort of more open source that way. We want people to take it and share it and use it, but we also want people to help improve it. Diversify it, help us see things that we're not seeing. Because we think that the lack of media literacy, education, and awareness in our society is everybody's problem, and everybody can be part of the solution. So I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Nolan Higdon, for being here today. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Thanks so much for being here again on Mickey Huff Park Center for Independent Media. We've got some literature down here. There's more snacks. Please feel free to take them with you. We've got brochures, stickers, and some books, other free literature and free magazines, independent media. Please feel free to stick around and talk with us if you'd like to and have time. And of course, if you want to take one of our books on these issues, please feel free to do that and be in touch.